This morning, I want to share with you guys just something that God has kind of, ever since I began seminary, kind of been wrestling, bringing me through, kind of allowing me to wrestle with it. And as going through this in my own studies, there was a couple points where I was like, man, I do not want to do this. Like, I don't want to study this and then share it with you guys, because in doing so, it's actually been doing a work in my own life and revealing things that I'm just like, so I get it when you say, I don't know if I want to. I want to hang on to that, and God says, no, time to go. Let's move that. Let's do some surgery here or there. And so just know that as I've been piecing this together, I think I've accepted Christ like 12 times because I was like, I'm not even sure if I'm a Christian after reading the Sermon on the Mount and then looking at it a little bit differently. So I'm just kidding. I'm still a Christian, don't worry. But that's what I wanted to share with you guys, just a little different way of looking at the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So that's kind of what we're going to do. We're going to tackle 3 points that I kind of put together, and I don't know, bear with this thing if it works, or if not, oh well, but we'll see, because in there are some keys that will help us walk through it. I don't know about you guys, I'm visually stimulated, so as I see those things, it helps me kind of remember what this guy's blabbing about. So if you just want to tap on each one of those ones, and I'll give you kind of like the forehead nod or the wink or the whatever. Or if anyone of you guys want to invest into a new clicker, just do that too. But let's read this together. It's in Matthew chapter 5. If you don't have it, it kind of is up there, so if that comes up. But follow along. I always read from the Holman, but it's pretty consistent with whatever you guys are reading. All right, so it starts with Matthew chapter 5, verse 11 through 20. And again, this is Jesus speaking. It's the Sermon on the Mount. It's fairly popular if you've read through the Gospels. But here Jesus is speaking, and he's talking to an interesting group of people. All right, but he starts with some crazy words, and it starts with saying, "You are blessed when they insult and persecute you, and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me." Think about that for a second. "Be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven, for that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled on by men." Verse 14 says, "You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine, so that they may see your good works and give glory to the Father in heaven." Let's see. No, all right. In heaven. Verse 17 says, "Do not assume that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." If you highlight or underline or star or anything, do that to verse 17. "For I assure you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all things are accomplished." Highlight, underline, all. "Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches people to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Then he sums it up in verse 20 for saying, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And if you have like the ability to draw like a little shuddering person right there next to verse 20, because that should intimidate you. But guys, the Sermon on the Mount, it teaches what it means to live the Christian life. How is one to live out a life represented and modeled after Christ? That should be the question that comes to mind after reading that section. And the first part of the sermon, it's the Beatitudes, right? And the woes. And they show that the Christian life is based on a very different set of values than what the world has to offer. So it goes through these lists, and it gives you a different way of living. Therefore, the first thing I think that you can understand in knowing how to live this Christian life is to notice how it's different from the world. Right? So there's a compare contrast kind of going on. The world says this, but I tell you this. God's word says this. Right? So that's the first thing. It gives you a different set of values. But also another distinction is that Christianity and the gospel is not only different from the world, but it's also different from religion. So not is it only different in its moral ethics of what to do, but it's also different Christianity from the gospel, from religion. I'm sorry, religion from the gospel, right? And shouldn't it be different? Shouldn't it look different? And I think understanding that, found in Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, that's the key, I think, to really understanding this whole talk that Jesus is delivering, this speech. In seminary, you read this guy named Karl Barth. He's a philosopher and a theologian, and you can go look him up if you want. But he has this interesting way of posing a question that I want to pose to you, right? And I'll explain it in a second. But he asked this: who killed Jesus? All right. So with that thought in mind, think about this, right? Karl Barth said that Barth says that to say that the Jews killed Jesus it's he says nonsense, and I'm paraphrasing here, okay? It's nonsense because it's not very specific. It's too broad. And so his example is Socrates, right? And Socrates was killed, right? But he was Greek. And so to say that the Greeks killed Socrates, and again, this is Barth speaking here, he's saying, like, that's too broad, right? Because didn't Jesus, he was Jewish, right? Socrates, he was Greek. So to just say, oh, the Greeks killed him, you got to be more specific. And so Barth is arguing and saying, okay, here's how I want to relate this to Jesus. Because Jesus was Jewish, he had Jewish friends, he also had Jewish enemies. So just to say that Jesus was killed by the Jews, that's not specific enough. Does that make sense? If so, nod your head like this. Because what I just shared with you, I had to read about 12 times to really actually understand what he was saying, and then reread it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to put that in like my understanding. So then he summarizes all that by saying, so who killed Jesus? Anyone know? True, but be more specific. I did. True, but be more specific. Sin. True. How dare. Yeah. Yes, true, but very broad. Specifically, in the New Testament, religious people killed Jesus. Religious people. Let that sink in for a second. Religious people killed Jesus. Now, all you have to do is read through the New Testament and see hostility by Jesus towards who? Religious people, right? Not the down and outers or the poor, right? Or the lowly. When Jesus gets around people of the world, or worldly people like we like to call them, he is kind, he's compassionate, he's long-suffering, he's merciful. Contrast that with when Jesus gets around the Pharisees or the religious leaders, and what is he? He's sharp. He's harsh, but just in what he's saying. I think that's pretty interesting. It was religious people that were the most angry at what Jesus said and would continue to say. It was the poor and the lowly who hung on every word that he said and were fascinated with every word that he said. Now, they might not agree with it, but guys, they hung to it. And some of it, too, might have been that people were just getting their needs met. Right? They were getting food. He was doing miracles. It was great. Right? Hanging around Jesus in those times, I mean, chances were good you were going to get a meal and you might have been healed if you were ailing. But they hung around Jesus. Contrasted with the religious leaders, man, every word he said, anger filled their hearts. They hated it. So much so that they picked up stones to kill him. But in reality, it wasn't his time yet. Right? And so one of the main points, if you're going to understand this contrast between Christianity and religion, between love, between Jesus on the cross, self-sacrificing love, versus religion. Religion is rooted, and we'll get into this a little bit later, in this idea of I'm doing things so that I'm in right standing. Right? So that contrast right? We're gonna kind of pry into, but that not only is that key to understanding the Sermon on the Mount, but it's what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 5-7. It's interesting. He says, in summary and in conclusion, at the end of the sermon, at the end of his talk, he lays out two ways, right? He says, I put them before you. And these are really famous statements. He says there's two paths, right? One leads to life, one leads to destruction. And then he tells a story about two trees, right? One has good fruit and one has a poisonous fruit. Then he goes on and he concludes with there's two houses. One, right? We always sing the song. One's built on the sand and the other one built on solid foundation, right? And Jesus says you have to choose. He says you have two ways, two trees, two houses, two ways of life. On the surface, they look much the same. But one of the ways is poisonous, ends in death. It poisons its eaters, it destroys its travelers, and it collapses on its residents in the picture of the house. So, what are the ways that Jesus puts in front of you in this sermon, in this talk, what he's sharing with these people? He's not saying not that way, this way, not that tree, this tree, not that house, this house. What are they? And here's where I shared with you earlier, like looking at this, it began to reshape, reform the way I thought about this. Traditionally, and I have to admit, I used to read it that way, right? That Jesus is saying you can either live according to the Sermon on the Mount, according to the law of God, the commandments of God, or not, right? Do this, don't do this. You can either obey God's law or disobey. Life or destruction. You see that kind of contrast there? Good fruit, bad fruit. You either live obeying God's law or disobeying God's law. And if it was just that, that would be simple, because guess which one I would try to put myself in? The one that's going to obey God's law. I'm going to be like, great, I'm doing good. Look at me. Check, check, right? Think about this, like one commentator said, it doesn't make sense that Jesus would say, in summary, there are two ways. They look extremely alike, but one of them has poisonous fruit. Right? That doesn't make sense that he would talk about these two ways and not include what to do with them within the talk that he's delivering. And just leave them there. Right? When you go through the sermon, you don't see Jesus saying, here are the people who are obeying God's law, and here are the people who aren't. I'm just warming up, guys. This is still the intro. Oh, hey, look at that. Let's see if it works. All right. He doesn't say, here are people who pray and people who don't pray. Are you guys beginning to see kind of this contrast that's beginning to form? This battle that's going on? No, he says, you pray like that, but I say you should pray like this. He doesn't say, here are people who give to the poor, and there are people who don't give to the poor. No, he says, some people give to the poor like that, but I tell you to give to the poor like this. He doesn't say there are people who obey the 10 Commandments and there are people who don't. No, he says, you hear the commandment, thou shalt not murder. You obey it like that, but I tell you, you should do it like this. Here's the scary thing, all right? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not contrast two ways, one good and one like bad. Do this, don't do this. Rather, both ways look good. Both groups are obeying God's law. Both groups are following the 10 Commandments. Both give to the poor, both go to church, both study the Bible, yet one is poisonous. And you see it in the very next verse. If I had it on there, it'd be verse 19. Check out verse 19. See what it says? Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. What thing stands out as the common bond between those two? What's that? There it is. Perfect. Notice that both groups in verse 19, when Jesus is talking, are in the kingdom of heaven. Some are doing well and some not so well. But they're both in the kingdom of heaven. Does that change your thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, the do's and don'ts? And it did for me. Now, the shuddering guy, if you put that next to verse 20. Because suddenly verse 20 says, however, there are religious people who are not in the kingdom at all. And he says of those people, your righteousness must surpass them. Right? And that's an intense statement. It must surpass their righteousness. What he is saying is not they're good, you're bad, or you're good and they're bad, but both are trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to do it. Both are trying to obey God. Jesus is saying Christianity, following Christ, is vastly beyond, it surpasses religion or religiosity. It's something completely different than religion. Following Christ, totally different than religion. Don't make the mistake following Jesus for religion. So don't think that Christianity is just going to church or doing worship or giving to the poor or praying. Those are all good things. But that's not, if you just leave it at that, that's not all Christianity is. You can do that and be poison, Jesus says. You can do that on the way to destruction. You can do that and your house still collapse in the sand. And does that scare you? I have to admit, it did for me. And maybe you're saying, wait a minute, you're kidding. I thought Christianity was about leaving the immoral life. You know, it was about doing the right thing, living according to the Bible and the example of Christ and the law of God. Isn't that it? Like, isn't that what I should be doing? And the answer is, no, but that's part of it. And if it only stays at that, then no, it's not. That's clearly involved, but if that's all it is, then you're missing the point of what the Sermon on the Mount has to unpack in your life. The key, as Jesus says, is that if you want to be in the kingdom of heaven, there's a love that vastly surpasses religiosity, that religiousness, right? So, here's my 3 points, right? So how does that play out? How does that look, right? How do you do that? Anyone wondering that? I mean, like, okay, so I see this. I see the conflict, right? I see the inner struggle going on in me, the things that I know I should be doing. Why am I doing them? Am I doing them out of duty base, or am I doing it out of just this overwhelming love for people and for God, right? And so how do I do that? And if you're asking that question, hey, me too. But let me pose 3 points to you, all right? And the first one is this. I don't know if it's on there. Hey. If you just want to tap it, go to the first one that says, gospel love is radiant, all right? Because love, God's love, gospel love, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, that's the gospel, the good news, right? That God is a God who self-sacrificed and gave himself, that is radiant. Jesus says that you are the light of the world. Notice there are two groups of people doing good deeds. One is doing it under a bowl, right? While the other is doing it in the way that attracts and delights the world. Right? So, therefore, the first difference between love, gospel love, and religiosity, or just doing religion for religion's sake, the first way that you can tell it's different is in its relationship to the world. Now, here's what I mean by that. That Christianity, that following Christ, is attracted to and attractive to. Okay? It's attracted, ED, and attractive, TIVE, too. Do you hear that? It's attracted and attractive to people who don't agree with you, right? Who don't live the way that you do, who don't believe what you believe. And Christianity, following Christ, is attractive and attracted to. But religious people are, they're turned off by that. So think about that. First of all, Christians are attracted to this. All right? They're attracted to. Notice when it says that they are the salt. Verse 13 says that you are the salt of the world, or of the earth. And if you think about salt, what is salt? Back in those days, the main thing salt was used for, it was a preservative. And you didn't really put salt in water because theoretically water didn't really go bad. But you put salt into meat, right? And because meat goes bad. It falls apart unless you put salt in it. What this tells us is that a follower of Christ, or a Christian, if you want to use that word, by nature of their following Christ or being a Christian, when they see things falling apart, they get in there. They go in. When you see somebody emotionally falling apart, you go in, like salt. When you see a neighborhood socially or economically falling apart, you go in. Christians are attracted, attracted. They're salt, bringing in deeds of like love and mercy. But religious people, notice the contrast here, are under a bowl. Now, what does that mean? It means that they really want to stick together, right? They don't like being out there with all those people who are different, right? They are not at all attracted to neighborhoods that are falling apart. They're all not attracted to people who are falling apart. That's the difference between religiosity, religiousness, if that's even a word, and Christianity. Not only that, but attracted, but they're attractive. Think about this. They're attractive to people who disagree with them, who live a very different life, and who don't believe what they believe. See, and here's how I can say this, because notice, not only do you have the idea of a beautiful light, right? They're radiant, of something that perseveres or preserves. That's salt. But salt has another side to it. The other job with salt is to make something taste good, right? Anybody here like salt? I would be completely content. I'm not a big sweets eater, but I'd be totally content to have like a jar of olives and some French bread, and that would like ease my salt fix. But think about what's coming up. 4th of July, right? We've got 4th of July. It's right around the corner, and for a lot of you guys, that might mean barbecue time, right? Now, how many of you guys have ever barbecued corn? Wrap it up in tin foil, put it on the barbecue, let it sit there, right? I love that. And I also love to put like butter and a little, not too much, but a little bit of salt. Anybody there like doing that? Right? But when you eat the piece of corn, I don't put it down and say, man, that was amazing salt. Right? I don't know if anyone's really said that, but that's usually not where our focus goes. We just say that was great corn, right? That was great corn on the cob. Why? Because of the job of the salt is not to make you think how great the salt is, but how great that thing is in which it's involved. Does that make sense? Now, play that out like applicably in your life. Let's say you're in a small group. What? Let's say you're in a life group, a little Bible study. If you're salt, people won't go away saying, man, that person really knows the Bible. They had it all together. They really showed me up. I asked that question and they tore me down. That's not salt. You know what a person would say walking away from a Bible study where whoever was interacting or leading it would say, man, what a great group. What fascinating truth. I never thought of it that way. That's so amazing. Right? The highlight is not on the salt, it's on what it enhances, what it does. Salt makes you feel better about life. Christians, followers of Christ, make you feel better. But I once listened to a guy preach a whole sermon. This is a total side note, sorry. I was sitting there, you ever thought like, man, I wonder if this guy knows what he's saying. He preached a whole sermon, and it was how big is your butt? Because it's God, but, right? It's the world, but God. And his whole point was, but God. And one of his titles was, how big is your butt? Sorry. All right, that's just how my brain works. But religious people, who only care about religiosity, doing the right thing, you walk away feeling condemned, unworthy, not good enough. They make you feel worse. I have a point in here that says cut if needed. I'm going to cut that. So the first point, guys, is that gospel love is radiant. It's attractive and it's attracted. It's radiant. The second thing is this, that gospel love, that God's love is deeper. It's deeper. Here's not, we're not talking about like the relationship with the world. We're talking about the relationship with your own heart, right? When Jesus said, "For I tell you, unless the righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees," we see that in verse 20, "and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And he knew that everyone listening to that must have been dumbfounded. They must have been shocked. Why? Why do you think? Because the Pharisees, who might have been listening, and just kind of observing, knew that those were full-time doers. The Pharisees were full-time professional law abiders, if you will. Right? And their job, what they did, was that they had to work the Bible into like 635-ish some odd laws of do's and don'ts. Right? They had the checklist, the positive laws, the negative laws, the things you had to do, the things you were supposed to avoid. They spent all day working on it. So when Jesus said your righteousness has to surpass, right away people must have said, yeah, okay, Jesus, how can that be? Like, how in the world can I do that? Who in the world could be more righteous than the teachers of the law, right? The Pharisees. So what do you think Jesus really meant by that? That he says you have to surpass this over and over again. And over means verse 21, 27, 31, 33, 43. He says, you have heard it said, you shall keep your promises and not lie. Well, I'm sorry. He goes through the 10 Commandments and he says, you have heard it said, right? And he begins with this idea of you shall not murder, right? You shall not commit adultery. You have heard it said, you shall keep your promises. Don't lie. And what he's doing is that in every case, he says, you religious people are concerned with the external, and I'm concerned with the internal, with the heart. You can have the external, and the heart will still be like everyone else in the world. If your heart is completely new, you'll have the external as well. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's what he does. And this sort of thing will just, at least it did for me, and I don't want, we'll walk away with something awesome, okay, I promise. But it's like we kind of wade through it real quick. And the sort of thing that he does, it just kind of makes your heart go like, oh, okay. Jesus says, okay, let's look at murder, okay? Let's look at murder. You have heard it said, you shall not murder. Now, if you're a good test to say like, okay, am I a religious person, or what is this guy talking about? Am I a follower of Jesus, right? Religious people are concerned about not physically murdering somebody. But I say to you, if in your heart you have ill will, if you despise them, if you think of people as fools, if you hate them, if you're indifferent towards them, you've already killed them. Then, to make it worse, he goes on to sex. You guys excited? You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. What's that all about? Jesus shows you. And this idea of he's contrasting physical nakedness with spiritual nature, with emotional, vulnerable nakedness. When you say to someone, I want to just be physically naked with you, but I don't want to give over my emotions and my feelings to you, right? Jesus calls that lust. And essentially what you're doing is stabbing yourself in the heart. Right? If you think, oh, thank God I haven't committed adultery. But, or you can't control your urges or this or that. And he says, that's lust. You've already done it. Moving on. Talks about oaths, telling the truth. He speaks about this. He says, you have heard it said that if you take an oath, you better stick with that oath. Right? But he says that's external. You signed a contract. If you break the contract, lawyers will come after you. Right? He says, I say unto you, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. And what does he mean by this? He says that your heart should be so full of integrity that every single thing you say, every yes and every no should be taken as seriously as if you had a stack of Bibles and you're just putting your hand on it and you're saying, yes. It's full of integrity. Right? External consequences mean nothing. Right? I'm so full of integrity. What about when he talks about turning the other cheek? Do you see how Jesus is walking through all of these do's and don'ts and just blowing them away and saying, yeah, that's good, but I'm telling you there's a whole other way to do this. And if you're not sure which list you're in, let this guide it, right? When he talks about turning the other cheek or not paying back, he means not just refraining from paying back, but still hoping for a relationship. Now, for me in my personal life and going through a divorce, this was a tough one to really wrestle with, right? This one was pretty difficult because there was a part of me that didn't want to see that person succeed. I wanted to see them fall flat on their faces so I can be like, ha, ha, ha. You know, you got what you deserve, you know. But that's not why you turn the other cheek. You don't turn the other cheek in order to get hit. It's interesting. Jesus points this out and says, don't you dare just refrain from like vengeance, like getting back. All right? I don't ask for that. I say that when you look at the person who has wronged you, no matter how messed up and how vicious they've been, you need to treat them with hope, with forgiveness. If you're going to oppose them, you should never oppose them except in love and in goodwill. Turn the other cheek. All right? So that by the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you imagine people just sitting there like wide-eyed, jaw to the floor. You're like a smoke of wreckage, right? You're just like, what in the world? How do I do this? You know, and thinking in our time, you know, Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, any teacher of ethics never demanded this of their followers. They never did. You can look it up. They never said, go this deep. He says, you have to surpass the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. You have to surpass the religious people. And what he really means is, I want all of you. I want your heart. Religion only worries about the external, what people can see. A lot of people follow the law. They don't commit adultery, they don't kill, they make sure they tell the truth, but they do it exactly the way the world does, out of fear and pride. This was hard for me as well. See, a religious person says, I tell the truth. And why? You know, a worldly person cheats and lies. The religious person says, I don't lie, I'm not like them. Why does that worldly person cheat and lie? That's fear. Some of the thinking behind lying is, you know, oh my goodness, I might lose my money or my reputation. That's fear, right? But on the other side of it is pride, right? It's as if you say, I'm going to get to them. I'm going to pull a number on them. You know, fear and pride lead people to lie. And why does a religious person choose not to lie, but to tell the truth? And here's what Jesus says. It's out of fear and pride. Right? The religious person would say, I better not lie. Or God's going to get me. He's going to get a hold of me. Right? He's going to take me out. The other reason a religious person might give for lying is that it's not like those kinds of people who do lie. At least, you ever thought like, at least I'm not like them. I mean, I've got this, but, oh man, at least I'm not like them over there. I'm a good person, right? Out of fear and pride, those people over there, right? They lie. But Jesus says, what's the difference? You ever wondered that? And this is why religiosity or religion minus love, it's so alienating. It's shallow, right? But gospel love, is radiant. It's radiant. Why? Because it's deeper. Right? It's deeper. It's deeper in that God says, well, the world says this, and it's deeper because God says, yeah, but this. It's deeper. And when this lines up, then this can't help but being radiant. See how that works? Which brings me to my last point, my third point. I couldn't think of a better word, but it's gospel love is tastier. It's tastier. All right? Gospel, God's love, it has a center of sweetness. I guess I could have said sweeter, but the good news about the Sermon on the Mount is when you read it carefully, you see that Jesus does not say, try to live like this, then God will be your Father. See that? Do this and then you'll get this. No, he doesn't say that. All the way through he says, you can live like this if you already know God is your Father. That's a big difference. You can live this way because you already know that God is your Father and that no matter what, he will still continue to be your Father. All right, in verse 16, right? In verse 16 he asks, why are you going to be able to let your light shine? Why are you going to have an attitude toward the world that's non-condescending? Why are you going to love people who disagree with you? Why are you going to be light? Why are you going to be bright? Right? And his answer, because God is your Father. And let me press in a little bit more. Let me go deeper. In chapter 6, he again says, don't worry. Right? Have no anxiety about anything. Now you say, what kind of command is that? What? Don't worry. How can I stop worrying? Now, again, a checklist. If you are living a religious life, right? One just based on religion, you might say, oh my goodness, I have to stop worrying. How do I do that? And Jesus says, wait, have no anxiety about these things. Because don't you see that I take care of the birds of the field? Right? The lilies of the field. Don't you understand that your heavenly Father, if he cares for them, see how much more you are valuable to him? And here's what Jesus is saying there. Right? He's showing us that on the Sermon on the Mount, is impossible unless you know you are valuable to God. Right? It actually just assumes it. It just assumes that you know your value, that God is your Father. Already your Father. Not earning more fatherliness. Right? In chapter 6, again, it says, the reason you pray is to get God to listen for you, right? To listen to your words. Now, a religious person might try to do that and try to gain value, right? A religious person might say, if I do all these good things, God will have to listen to me, right? And people will hear my words and they'll honor me. That's why, like, deep inside, you're filled with fear and pride for someone who lives in a way that they want to earn God as their Father. It's overwhelming. But actually, Christianity, following Christ, means obeying God's law out of value. You're already loved, not seeking value. And that is amazing. That is good news. That's the gospel. It's what he did. That's why I believe God's love is tastier. It's tastier than anything the world can offer. Right? A knowledge that you, his child, are of incredible value to him. Right? That there's nothing he would not do in order to keep you and to hold you. He's a father. He's not a boss. In fact, I actually saw this play out. And we're kind of closing up here and wrapping up a little. But I saw this play out as a youth pastor. And when I worked with parents, I noticed something about fathers and mothers. And so if you're a father or mom here, you might recognize this. And if you have children, which I don't, and one of them is being disobedient, so often the disobedient one has your heart the most. Why do you think that is? Right? Is that, you don't have to answer this, but is that true in your life? I definitely noticed it when working with parents in youth. They would come to me and say, oh my gosh, what is going wrong with this person? What is happening with my son or my daughter? Why are they doing this? Why? Well, it's the nature of parenthood. Jesus says the secret of the difference between gospel and religiosity is that you have God as a father. And that happens before you can obey. It's not something you do in order to get, but it causes you to obey. When you know God is your Father, it changes everything about you. So if you're here this morning, which you are because you're here, and you're saying, I'm not sure I'm a Christian, right? Or this even applies to me. Let me suggest something, right? The Sermon on the Mount, it's not a ladder, right? It's not a way to like climb up to God. If I do this, if I don't do this, if I do certain things or don't do those certain things. It says there are two ways, right? One way is to say, out of my goodness, right? Out of love, I will seek to get God and other people to give me what I want. It's a feeling of approval or worth. Okay? Or you can say, I'm going to build my whole life and approach to God on what Jesus has done for me. So, simply put, be your own Savior or let Him be your Savior. Right? So, look at the Sermon on the Mount. First of all, Jesus is the only one who has ever lived the Sermon on the Mount. First of all, it's amazing to look at. Right? That if you're amazed by the character in this sermon, in this talk, it's because it's Jesus. Right? He's the only one who is ever able to fulfill all of it and live that way. Right? And not only that, he didn't just fulfill most of the Sermon on the Mount, he fulfilled the Beatitudes as well. Right? And here's how he did that. Right? He said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." But Jesus, though he was merciful, did he receive mercy? No, he didn't. He was condemned. He said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, right? For they shall see God." Jesus, who was pure in heart, did not see God, but rather, remember when he was on the cross and God turned his face away from him on the cross? That's why he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken or turned your face from me?" Jesus said the meek will inherit the earth, right? And he was absolutely meek, but he was also disenfranchised. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Nobody hungered and thirsted after righteousness like Jesus, except he wasn't fulfilled. In the garden, it says he was emptied. He was poured out. Right? On the cross, he said, "I thirst." And here's why. Here's why. He, though meek, lost his inheritance. So why? So that us, me, who are not meek, could get it. Right? He, though pure in heart, didn't see God. Why? So that you and I, who aren't pure in heart, could. He, though merciful, right, obtained no mercy, so that you and I, who are not merciful, could. Jesus said, "I have utterly fulfilled the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, when you believe in me, not only does everything that you deserve come on to me, but everything I've done comes on to you." That, my friends, is good news. That means when God looks at you, he sees someone who is as beautiful as the person who does the Sermon on the Mount every single day. Absolutely every day. And I don't know about you guys, but like I said, that is great news. That God has done that already. That's good news yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Let me pray with you guys real quick. We'll go in there. God, we thank you for your word, which is true no matter whether we choose to believe it's truth or not. We thank you that it is without error. And we thank you, God, that it is always piercing. It is always searching. It is always, it always desires to know us more intimately. So God, I ask as we go from here, Lord, let it pierce, let your word just pierce into our hearts and our minds, and let us expose those things in ourselves, myself included, God, that you want to remove. God, we thank you so much for just this opportunity we have to come and be together, the freedom that we have, the prices that were paid. Thank you for the price that you ultimately paid. God, we love you. We ask that you would be with us in all that we do. In your name, amen. That's it. Guys, thank you so much. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday and a great week.